Microsoft products are being phased out by individual municipalities or federal states or organizations. There is one of the federal states, Schleswig Holstein, who has been starting a transition to open source and Linux a long while back. They were probably one of the pioneers in the EU trying to ditch Microsoft.
When people say Bill Gates should be worried, they are not talking about online outrage. They are pointing to real shifts happening at multiple levels. European governments are replacing Microsoft tools with Linux and open source alternatives. When policymakers and hardware giants both start moving, it signals a broader change in the foundations that sustained Microsoft's dominance.
They're also ditching Microsoft Teams. Basically, they are trying to be Microsoft free entirely, or as much as can be. Another one.
Across Europe, governments are quietly reconsidering their dependence on Microsoft, and this shift is no longer theoretical. In Germany, the federal state of Schleswig Holstein has begun moving roughly 30,000 government computers away from Windows and Microsoft Office toward Linux and LibreOffice. The goal is not just cost-cutting, it is digital sovereignty. Officials argue that relying on foreign proprietary platforms leaves public infrastructure exposed to geopolitical tension and vendor control.
They're going to replace Microsoft Office with LibreOffice, and Linux could very well come in the future. In France, where I live, the city of Lyon also decided to ditch Microsoft Office and might also ditch Windows in the future to replace it with Linux. They're not moving to LibreOffice, they're moving to only Office.
France is moving in similar directions. The city of Lyon has committed to replacing Microsoft Office with only Office and is evaluating broader open source adoption. The French gendarmerie has already standardized on a customized Ubuntu system across tens of thousands of machines. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs clarified that it is replacing Microsoft Office with LibreOffice, even if Windows remains for now. These are not isolated experiments. They reflect a growing concern about strategic autonomy.
Years in the EU trying to ditch Microsoft, and they did so. They had announced their plan to move away from Microsoft Office and also from Windows a few years back, but now they're actually implementing it.
As these initiatives spread, the cost conversation becomes impossible to ignore. Microsoft's updated enterprise licensing models have steadily increased subscription dependency across public sectors. Governments are no longer paying once for software. They are paying annually for access, support tiers, cloud integration, and compliance add-ons. Across thousands of departments and agencies, those recurring obligations compound into long-term financial exposure. For administrations managing taxpayer budgets, subscription escalation is not abstract. It is measurable and politically sensitive.
Here, but it's not just the EU. A lot of other countries in the world are already moving away from Microsoft, whether it be North Korea, China working on their own Linux systems, you have India, who is a big user of Linux as well. A lot of other countries are also doing the same. Or
the Windows 11 hardware transition intensified the pressure. Millions of still functional government machines across Europe were suddenly classified as unsupported due to TPM requirements and CPU restrictions. That means forced refresh cycles, capital expenditure spikes, and procurement complications. Replacing entire device fleets because of operating system policy is not trivial for public institutions. It forces budget reallocations that compete with healthcare, education, and infrastructure.
To be honest, if you need Excel, Google Sheets is not cutting it at all. Well, if you have a monopoly, you can raise your costs. When everyone uses Windows, you can raise the cost of licenses, you can raise the cost of support, you can force people to move to the latest OS or force them onto more costly support plans as well. Which means staying on Microsoft solutions is getting more and more and more expensive.
At the same time, digital sovereignty debates gained urgency. European policymakers increasingly question whether core government systems should depend on a single foreign vendor subject to external political decisions. Open source alternatives offer code transparency, local control, and the ability to adapt systems without waiting for corporate roadmaps. This is not ideological enthusiasm. It is strategic risk management.
Worked. For example, back in 2003, Munich decided to ditch Windows to go with Linux, with their own Linux distro called Linux, probably Mux for Munich. They moved 14,000 PCs from Windows to Linux, and
the momentum does not yet represent a continent-wide migration. it remains fragmented and uneven. But the pattern is visible. Municipalities test alternatives. Ministries reassess contracts. Procurement teams evaluate non-Microsoft stacks. Once multiple governments begin reviewing long-standing dependencies simultaneously, the shift moves from symbolic resistance to structural reconsideration.
Hell, maybe even better to run Linux on your computer for gaming or productivity than Windows or macOS.
And then there is Recall. Microsoft introduced Recall as a flagship feature for Copilot Plus PCs. The system captured screenshots of everything displayed on a user's screen every few seconds, processed the content with optical character recognition, and stored the extracted text in a searchable local database. The promise was convenience. You could describe something you saw weeks ago and instantly retrieve it.
Microsoft is blocking more ways to set up a Windows 11 local account. When announcing Windows 11 Insider Preview builds 26.120.6772, Microsoft revealed that they are removing known mechanisms for setting up an offline or local account.
Security researchers quickly tested that promise. They found that the initial implementation stored captured data in an unencrypted SQLite database located in a standard user folder. That meant passwords, financial information, private messages, and sensitive business documents could be aggregated in a single location. A simple script was enough to scrape months of activity. Because the database was accessible once a user was logged in, traditional disk encryption did not prevent exploitation through malware.
After everything we've discussed here, everything we have gone over, do you think that it's just the sleep function being broken? Or do you think perhaps the company which is sharing all of your data with hundreds of advertisers perhaps is trying to get more of your data?
The backlash was immediate. The United Kingdom's Information Commissioner's Office launched an investigation. Legal experts raised concerns about compliance with European data protection laws, which carry potential penalties of up to 4% of global revenue for serious violations. Microsoft eventually shifted Recall to an opt-in feature and added additional security layers. Even so, independent testing later found that sensitive information filters were inconsistent. Some financial data was still captured under certain conditions. That is why this moment matters. The discussion is no longer about whether Linux can function inside government environments. It is about whether continued reliance on Microsoft aligns with Europe's financial and geopolitical priorities moving forward.
Try telling your boss that it's Microsoft's fault that you can't finish your work. And furthermore, how many times has an update broken another app or program that was working perfectly fine before?
For decades, Microsoft's dominance depended on Windows being the default operating system on nearly every mainstream PC. When the largest manufacturers begin adjusting that default, whether through Linux rollouts or public admissions of failed AI demand, the foundation shifts. The question is no longer whether Windows will remain important. The question is whether it can maintain the automatic position it once took for granted.
Microsoft had no choice but to lay off 9,000 people despite making record profits because, as Nadella said in his response, there's so many once great tech companies that simply vanished, and every time it was because of AI.
Linux desktop market share reached 11.4% globally by late 2025, up from just 3.1% 3 years earlier. That is a 268% increase in a category that historically moved at a glacial pace. Desktop operating systems do not usually swing that quickly. More revealing than the percentage itself is where those users came from. Survey data from tens of thousands of new Linux adopters showed that 87% previously used Windows. This is not Linux pulling users from Mac or Chrome OS. This is Windows losing its own base.
Lenovo is already well represented within the Linux hardware community, having certified a swath of its devices for various different distros.
Gaming trends reinforce the same story. Steam's hardware survey showed Linux usage rising from 1.4% in early 2023 to 9.3% by late 2025. Nearly 1 in 10 Steam users now runs Linux. Compatibility tools like Proton removed one of the biggest historical barriers to switching. When gamers discover that 70 to 80% of their library works without major tweaks, the perception that Linux is unusable for everyday tasks collapses. Once perception changes, inertia weakens.
Windows 10 works great on these older computers. But Windows 11 goes in the complete opposite direction, has strict hardware requirements. And so if you don't have a newer processor in your computer, you can't install the operating system at all.
Zorin OS became one of the clearest examples of this migration wave. Its latest release surpassed 2 million downloads in roughly 3 months. According to the project's own reporting, the majority of those downloads came from former Windows 10 and Windows 11 users. Zorin deliberately mimics the familiar Windows layout, lowering the psychological barrier to entry. For users frustrated with forced upgrades, ads in the start menu, or AI integrations they never requested, the switch no longer feels intimidating. Lenovo already maintains a significant Linux presence, especially in business and developer markets. Estimates suggest around 15 million Linux-capable systems across various product lines. If HP, Dell, and Lenovo together push towards 60 million Linux units annually, that approaches nearly 1/3 of a global PC market that hovered around 194 million units in recent years. At that point, Linux is no longer a niche alternative. It becomes a mainstream option, presented directly to consumers at retail.
Shows Lenovo planning to treat Linux like a first-class citizen. Stuff like a Linux equivalent to Lenovo Vantage. Stuff like global availability and shipping.
Retail dynamics accelerate the shift. Stores care about return rates, support calls, and customer satisfaction scores. If Windows 11 devices show return rates near 9.7%, while Linux pilot devices show rates closer to 1.8%, retailers notice. Each returned laptop costs money in processing and refurbishment. Fewer support calls mean lower service overhead. Positive reviews improve online ranking and recommendation algorithms. These are operational advantages, not ideological ones.
Lenovo announces that it will certify its ThinkStation PCs and ThinkPad P-Series laptops for both Ubuntu LTS and Red Hat Enterprise Linux.
Amazon's marketplace illustrates how this compounds. Products with higher average ratings rise in search results. If Linux-based laptops average 4.6 stars compared to 3.8 stars for comparable Windows models, algorithms reward them. Microsoft cannot control retail algorithms. It cannot prevent shoppers from comparing prices and reading reviews that praise speed, simplicity, and lack of bloatware.